So the next film that we're going to talk about is a film that both me and Ria have actually seen, which is the only time that this is actually the case. So this is going to be quite an interesting discussion. So this is The Killing of a Sacred Deer, which is directed by Yorgos Lanthimos, whose previous films that I've seen anyway are Dogtooth, which I really like, very, very weird film, very fucked up, but in a good way. Alps, which is alright, kind of similar, and The Lobster, which you have reviewed elsewhere, haven't you?
I have. If anybody listened to what to watch on Netflix, the Post Pop podcast, which I have tweeted and posted about, Greg and I are both on one episode each, and one of my picks was The Lobster. For my 3 recommendations for what to watch on Netflix. So I recently watched that in preparation for Killing of a Sacred Deer, which was great. And I really loved The Lobster, but I actually do think I preferred Killing of a Sacred Deer.
Yeah, it's weird. So I was going to kind of talk about this in a little bit more detail, like when we've kind of gone through like the synopsis and stuff. But I mean, with The Lobster, I really liked it, but I felt that the first half of The Lobster was better than the second half by quite a long way. Essentially, once Colin Farrell's character, once he leaves the hotel, it's sort of not quite as good, which is very noticeable. So that kind of spoilt it for me. Whereas this, to me, kind of it was very consistent all the way through.
Yeah, I agree. I felt like it was a little slower in the second half of Lobster, whereas in this one, it's perhaps a little slower to start with, but you expect that from most films, so it really gets going in the second half.
Okay, so what is a synopsis of Killing of a Sacred Deer, for those who don't know?
Okay, so Stephen, a charismatic surgeon, played by Colin Farrell, is forced to make an unthinkable sacrifice after his life starts to fall apart when the behaviour of a teenage boy he has taken under his wing turns sinister.
So the first thing that I noticed when I was watching the film, and this isn't really a spoiler because this is literally the introduction of the film, is that it starts with open heart surgery. Again, it's the third time this year that we've had a film that starts with heart surgery, although I'm assuming this wasn't real heart surgery. Although, to be honest, it's hard to tell. It looked pretty real, didn't it?
I mean, they could have perhaps filmed that. It did look pretty real. Maybe they had some stock footage from, medical reports or something. Who knows?
Okay. So, overall thoughts of the film before we kind of just talk about it in a little bit of detail.
Well, once again, like The Shape of Water, I went to the gala on the Thursday night, so I was very privileged again to see Colin Farrell and Nicole Kidman on the red carpet outside, and then on the stage with the 2 child actors that are in the film, which are Rafi Cassidy and Barry Cohen, I think that's how you say it, the guy that plays Martin. Also with director Yorgos Lanthimos. So that was a privilege to see that, and there was a lot of excitement around it. So that made it, all the better for going there. General thoughts. I thought this was not as dark as Dogtooth, which for me was perhaps a little too weird, although I did enjoy it. But it was a lot more clever than anything that he's done before. Lobster was still dark, but this was darker. And it had such an interesting plot and such high stakes that it was just incredibly exciting. And there's still a lot of dark humour in this film to kind of lighten the mood. But it's actually kind of unbelievable, like what kind of things happen in this film. You just find yourself absolutely glued to it. What are your general thoughts on this, Greg? How did you find it?
Well, I really liked it. So I know what you're saying about it's interesting that you say like this really dark humor which lightens the mood, which it kind of does, because like The Lobster, this is almost pitched as this very, very black comedy, because some of the stuff that they bring up, and these are not jokes where they really, really hammer it over you that like, oh my god, like we're being really funny now. It's stuff which is very almost inappropriate, but the characters say them at like very straight faced, which
Yeah.
makes it funny.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's a lot of, and I've noticed this in his other films as well, there's a lot of um, like adolescent awkwardness, body awkwardness, sex and nudity in terms of dark humour. There's some unusual sexual taste in this film. I won't give too
Very
much
much so,
away.
yeah.
It's a very taboo film. There's also a kind of underlying, parallel storyline with kind of a bit of a bunny boiler sort of plot going on, which is quite sinister as well. And he has featured in his other film, in Dogtooth, this kind of adolescent sort of first sex awkwardness as well. And then in this film, that's kind of mirrored with couples throughout the film in terms of weird sex stuff. So yeah, like without giving too much away, there's quite a few elements of that featured throughout the film that do kind of make you sort of go, whoa, okay.
Yeah, yeah, I agree what you mean about the whole first sort of sexual awakening and the awkwardness of sort of sex and coupling, particularly when you're young. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that in there. And yeah, as you said, some very kinky, shall we say, although not graphic.
Mm.
It's certainly the implication more than the actual reality of very kinky sex, shall we say. And yeah,
Yeah.
I agree that the plot, it's a revenge plot, so to speak, and it could come from like the early 90s from something like Fatal Attraction or the films that came after that, or even something like, I don't know, a revenge film that I really like, for example, is like Dead Man's Shoes by Shane
Yeah.
Meadows, which is a really, really good film that I highly recommend.
Mm.
Um, now this is a thing. I've had this conversation with my brother because my brother is very different from me. He hated The Lobster, for example.
Whereas you recommended The Lobster to me and you were like, I think you're going to like this. And I actually really did like it. So I was completely
Yeah.
sold.
This is why I don't really talk about films with my brother, and I do talk about them with you, because we're on very, very different wavelengths. So Lanthimos' style is very weird. So characters, they talk in a very deliberate way, almost like this, almost as if they're robots, and they're not really people. Do you get what I mean? So sort of like
Yeah,
that.
that's one of the things that I've noted down here is that it's kind of rambling, awkward dialogue, and there's also a lot of awkward movements in this film which are deliberate. Like, there are reasons for that. It's part of the script, it's part of what's going on. But in the way that he's directed this, like, it's incredibly well acted when, you know, actors are having to make such awkward movements in films like that, but comes across as though it's completely necessary. But that, the dialogue, awkward movements, all together, it just creates this really surreal, dreamlike sort of quality to the entire film, where you kind of always questioning, is this actually happening, or is this somebody's like daydream? Are they going to snap out of it, or are we going to find out that none of this really happened? You know, it's just so surreal, it doesn't feel like it's really happening.
Yeah, I agree with that, definitely, in terms of like the dreamlike feel of the film itself. And what I was taken by is the way that the film is shot, because the film is shot in a very deliberate way. So, for example, so you've got Stephen, who's the main character, and you've got Martin, who's sort of the antagonist, I guess, in a way, in the film, and they have
Yeah.
these very weird meetings right at the start of the film. And I noticed that the way that Lantimos framed these was very interesting, in that their conversations would almost be happening like on the edge of the frame or in the distance, which I
Mm.
thought was quite interesting, which kind of tells you a lot about their relationship, in that there's not really any close-ups as such, or they're in very odd parts of the frame. As I said, I found that very interesting kind of use of cinematography
Yeah.
there. Another thing that I really like is I've seen that this film's been compared almost to like Stanley Kubrick a lot, which I can see, and it's in two ways. First of all, it's sort of the use of the tracking shots, particularly through the hospital. Really, really love tracking shots and steady cam shots, which this film sort of has a lot of, particularly in those kind of scenes. And there's some very, very interesting shots. There's a shot of an escalator at one point in the film, and it's shot from above, which I
Yeah.
felt looked really awesome. And also through the use of the score, which the score has a lot of very discordant classical music on it, which
Yeah,
I
it's a
felt
nice touch. I liked that.
worked really well with the film itself. I felt, yeah, it gave this very off-kilter, sort of off-center feel and kind of added to the dreamlike quality, as you said.
Yeah, for anybody who's seen The Lobster, I felt that the music was fairly similar, the score.
Yeah, I think
Similar style.
yeah, I think Lantimos, he uses a lot of the same collaborators whenever he makes films. So his co-writer, I think, is his girlfriend. Possibly, I could be completely wrong about that, but he's had the same writer for a lot of his films, and he must use a lot of the same kind of behind-the-scenes people. Even though, as I said, the Dogtooth was made in Greece, which is obviously his native country, but he lives in the UK, and I think it's helped, you know, his last couple of films where he's made it in the UK and he's able to get all this international talent. You know, say,
Yeah.
you know, Nicole Kidman, for fuck's sake, you know.
Yeah,
So
she, interestingly enough, on stage when they did the intro, they really wanted Nicole to speak, and she in person she's just astounding looking, and she comes across so well, like such a humble, like lovely person. She's so striking looking, even more so than on screen. I was quite taken aback by it. I've always thought that she's a fantastic actress, but it wasn't until that point when I did see her on stage talking about her work on this film that I really have a newfound respect for her. And she basically said that herself and Lantimos had talked for some time about working on something together, and she was just a huge fan of his work and just so wanted to do this film, and finally it has, you know, been done, and she was just so pleased about it, both of them were. It was incredibly humbling to hear, and just fantastic that she was so passionate about it. And like I said, about Barry Cohen being up there, he was very popular outside on the red carpet. He's just done Dunkirk and this film, so he's obviously on his way to stardom. He's doing incredibly well. So he was very popular outside with people wanting photographs and statements. And I just thought he was utterly incredible in this film. Like, there's nobody else that could have played that part like he did, basically.
yeah, I thought I'd recognised him from somewhere, and yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, I've seen Dunkirk, and yeah, of course he's in that as well. Fuck, why didn't I realise that at the time? And yeah, he is really good in this. He plays it. It's very interesting because the way that, because it's a very kind of fraught film, because it's, I don't know, I guess another director may have done this as a thriller and it would have been a lot more melodramatic, but there isn't really a lot of hysteria in the film, in terms of like, there's not really any sort of shout. Well, there is shouting, but there isn't any kind of like in Fatal Attraction, like that kind of level of like fraught kind of like, you know, why are you doing this, or kind of thing like that. It's
Yeah.
more very buttoned down, as you said, and very straight. It's very, very bizarre, but it works really well, I think.
Yeah, almost makes it more unnerving that it is played so straight. And there's actually a very good use of silence, I think. I mean, the score's not running throughout. There's quite a lot of awkwardness in the silence that he uses as well, I think.
And yeah, great scene with Alicia Silverstone as well, who appears in one scene, but it's a very, very funny scene. For anyone who's seen the movie, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, amazing. So I would highly recommend this film. So for my first two films of London Film Festival, I saw some absolutely outstanding films. I really couldn't believe my luck, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is the kind of quality that you get at LFF. Well, what can I say? And yeah, I agree. It's a very, very good film. I look forward to watching it again at some point.
Yeah,
Just to,
it's out soon,
yeah,
isn't it? Is it next month? Is it out?
yeah. It comes out in November. So if you haven't seen it, I mean, would you say it's a horror film? Because this is the only thing that I would sort of think of to
Oh,
say, sort of as a in
well,
passing.
it's actually listed as drama, horror, mystery, so it is categorized as horror.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it does come across as a dark drama, I would say. But saying that, IMDb does say it is a horror as well, so it scores very
Well,
highly at the moment on IMDb. It's 8.1 on here.
yeah. Well, if IMDb says it's a horror film, clearly what they say goes. So yeah. I mean, I can see why people would say it's a horror film. The thing is, and this is kind of the more interesting overarching theme of the films that I saw, maybe not necessarily the films that you saw, because the films you saw are a lot more straight horror a lot of the time. It's this whole debate about kind of what is and isn't a horror film, because a lot of the films that play at LFF, as opposed to Fright Fest, it's kind of they are sort of horror films, but it's almost as if the people who made them gone, yeah, I don't really want to make a straight horror film. I like horror, but I don't know, maybe they feel too limited by horror films themselves, by what they can do in that kind of construct. So
Hmm.
they decided, well, I'm going to do this instead, which sort of is horror, but not really, or maybe it is. I don't know. So it's very interesting because a hardcore horror fan, or the types that I see online anyway, they probably wouldn't like this film, I would say, which is their loss, by the way.
Exactly, whereas I would prefer to go for something more different, even though I do like straight up horror films. But for me, something a bit more like dark and clever and different, like Killing of a Sacred Deer, that's much more me because it does make you think a lot more and it's very surprising. You can never predict where something like that is going to go.